Hannibal, the complete story of the greatest general of antiquity. Introduction. Rome and Carthage before Hannibal. At the dawn of Mediterranean history, when cities and peoples fought for supremacy in a fragmented world, two powers rose above all the rest: Rome and Carthage. Rome was a city forged in war. After subduing Etruscans, Samnites, and Gauls, the Republic had built a solid state, led by a determined ruling class and supported by a disciplined army that turned every citizen into a soldier. Its strength did not come from gold or commerce, but from civic duty and the iron organization of the legions. Carthage, by contrast, was a daughter of the sea. Founded by Phoenician settlers on the coasts of North Africa, it became a wealthy and cosmopolitan metropolis. Its ships crossed the Mediterranean from Hispania to Sicily, carrying grain, metals, and slaves. Its armies were made up of mercenaries, Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, men who fought for pay, not for homeland. If Rome was a republic of farmer soldiers, Carthage was an empire of merchants and adventurers. Between them lay Sicily, fertile and strategic. Whoever controlled the island would command the sea routes and the balance of power across the entire Mediterranean. From this rivalry was born the first great conflict between Rome and Carthage, a war that would last more than 20 years and serve as the prelude to a new tragedy. But from that fire would also emerge a name destined to become legend. A child, son of a Carthaginian general, who would grow up under the weight of defeat and bound by a vow of vengeance. That child would become the greatest enemy Rome had ever known. His name was Hannibal Barca, and before his star would shine, the blood of Romans and Carthaginians had already stained the fields of Sicily at the beginning of the First Punic War. Chapter 1. The First Punic War. In the early years of the Roman Republic, when its power was only beginning to stretch beyond the Italian peninsula, no one could have imagined that it would become the force destined to dominate the Mediterranean. Rome was still a young power, with no naval tradition, no experience in great clashes between empires. Carthage, by contrast, had grown over centuries as the heir of Phoenician wisdom, becoming the great mistress of trade and of the western seas. At that time, the two worlds were fated to meet, and the stage of their first clash was Sicily. Sicily was the most coveted island in the Mediterranean. Its fertile fields produced abundant grain. Its ports, situated on the route between Italy, Africa, and Hispania, offered unmatched strategic advantages. Greeks and Carthaginians had founded colonies there long before Rome had even thought of expanding. For Carthage, Sicily was almost a natural extension of its maritime dominion. For Rome, it was a direct threat to its own security. If the African power consolidated its hold on the island, southern Italy would lie at the mercy of Carthaginian fleets. The conflict began in what seemed like a trivial way. In the city of Messina, in the northeast of the island, a garrison of Campanian mercenaries known as the Mamertines had seized control by force, expelling the Greek inhabitants. Surrounded by enemies and fearing the reprisal of Syracuse, the Mamertines sought help first from Carthage and then from Rome. It was Rome's intervention, under the pretext of protecting an ally, that precipitated direct confrontation. Until then, Rome and Carthage had maintained an ambiguous relationship, competitors in some spheres, occasional allies against common threats. But the arrival of the legions in Sicily transformed that relationship forever. Rome sent troops to Messina. Carthage reacted immediately. War had been declared, and neither side could retreat without losing prestige and position. What followed was a long and exhausting conflict, the first of a series of wars that would bear the name Punic, derived from the Latin word punicus, used to designate the Carthaginians of Phoenician origin. The first surprise was that Rome, which had never had a fleet, was forced to build one from scratch. They captured Carthaginian ships and used them as models, constructing hundreds of vessels in an astonishingly short time. To train their crews, Roman soldiers practiced naval maneuvers on dry land, in drills where they mimicked rowing to the beat of drums. And since true seafaring skill could not be gained overnight, they added an invention that would change the course of the war: the corvus. It was a wooden boarding bridge with a large spike at the end, which could be dropped onto an enemy ship to pin it down. In this way, the Romans turned naval warfare into what they did best: hand-to-hand combat, as if the sea itself were a battlefield on land. The effect was devastating in the first encounters. In battles where Carthage was expected to triumph thanks to its naval experience, Rome achieved stunning victories. The discipline of the legions, carried onto the decks, proved superior to the seamanship of the Carthaginians. Little by little, the Romans also learned to maneuver at sea, and what had begun as a weakness became a weapon of the first order. Meanwhile, on land, the war spread across Sicily. Cities switched sides constantly, sometimes under Carthaginian pressure, sometimes seduced by Rome's promises. It was a conflict of endless sieges, fragile alliances, and constant betrayals. Neither of the two contenders was willing to yield. Carthage trusted in its wealth and in its ability to hire new mercenaries. Rome relied on the unshakable loyalty of its citizens, who time and again answered the call of the Republic. The struggle grew ever fiercer. Carthage brought into the island its best generals, men seasoned in the art of war. Rome sent consuls and proconsuls who replaced one another year after year, always determined to carry on the campaign. The rivalry between the two empires grew with every battle, and what had begun as a local incident in Messina had turned into a struggle for hegemony over the Western Mediterranean. As the war dragged on, the Western Mediterranean became the stage for colossal clashes. Rome, which had entered the conflict without a single ship of its own, was soon deploying fleets of more than 100 vessels, while Carthage relied on its veteran sailors, experts in the sea routes and currents. Naval supremacy was decisive. Whoever controlled the sea ensured the supply of their troops in Sicily and could sever the enemy's lines of communication. The first great Roman victories at sea astonished the ancient world. With the aid of the corvus, legionaries boarded Carthaginian ships and turned them into platforms for land-style combat. In one famous encounter, a Roman fleet sank or captured dozens of Carthaginian vessels in a single battle, proving that discipline and innovation could overcome naval experience. It was a shocking blow for Carthage, which for centuries had relied on maritime dominance as its guarantee of security. But the sea was treacherous as well. Rome, elated with its new naval power, suffered immense losses, not so much from enemy action as from the fury of nature. Entire fleets were destroyed by storms, with hundreds of ships dashed against the coasts or swallowed by the deep. The figures were staggering: tens of thousands of men lost to shipwrecks, a human cost that would have broken the will of any other nation. Yet the Roman Republic did not surrender. Every disaster was followed by renewed effort. Every fleet lost was replaced by another, built in record time thanks to the obstinacy of the Senate and the sacrifice of its citizens. Carthage, though less afflicted by the elements, faced its own problems. Its military strength rested on hired mercenaries: Iberians from Hispania, Gauls from Gaul, Numidians from Africa. Fierce warriors, no doubt, but whose loyalty was tied to gold and not to a homeland. In prolonged campaigns, the instability of these contingents became evident. Desertions, mutinies, and internal rivalries at times weakened the Carthaginian army, while the Romans, fighting for their republic, displayed a cohesion that compensated even for their most painful defeats. In Sicily, the war became a succession of endless sieges. Fortified cities changed hands again and again. Syracuse, an occasional ally of one side or the other, remained a constant source of uncertainty. The conflict dragged on, draining the resources of both powers. Rome sent each year new consuls, each eager to win glory in Sicily. Carthage answered with seasoned generals who kept the resistance alive. No victory was final, no defeat decisive. The magnitude of the conflict impressed all the peoples of the Mediterranean. Never before had two states waged such a long and costly war. The losses in men and ships were counted in tens of thousands. The finances of both powers were strained, yet neither showed any sign of surrender. Rome, thanks to its inexhaustible reservoir of citizen soldiers, seemed capable of enduring any sacrifice. Carthage, with its commercial wealth, could continue hiring new hosts of mercenaries. The struggle had become a contest of endurance, a clash of wills. The balance slowly tilted toward Rome. Every time the Republic suffered a disaster, it was reborn with greater strength, as if adversity itself gave it renewed energy. Carthage, by contrast, began to show signs of exhaustion. Though its generals fought bravely, the lack of political unity and the dependence on foreign soldiers weakened its effort. While Carthaginian senators debated in their halls over the costs of war, the Roman Senate made swift and radical decisions, willing to sacrifice everything in the name of victory. Thus, after nearly 2 decades of fighting, the scales began to tip irreversibly. Rome had shown that it could fight both on land and at sea, that its discipline could withstand not only the fury of the Carthaginians, but also the violence of the storms. The Carthaginian dream of maintaining maritime supremacy was slowly fading, and the end of the war was drawing near, though it would still cost countless lives. After more than 20 years of relentless struggle, the conflict reached its climax. Rome, through superhuman effort, had managed to dominate the seas, while in Sicily, its legions maintained constant pressure on the last Carthaginian positions. The conclusion came with the great naval battle of the Aegates Islands, where the Roman fleet, rebuilt once more after earlier catastrophes, inflicted a decisive defeat on Carthage. Hundreds of ships were destroyed or captured, and with them collapsed the last hopes of African resistance. Carthage, exhausted and without resources, had no choice but to sue for peace. It was a bitter surrender. The proud metropolis, which for centuries had dominated the Western Mediterranean, was forced to hand Sicily over to the Romans, its most precious possession. In addition, it had to pay a massive indemnity, which emptied the state's coffers and humiliated its leaders. Shortly afterward, Rome took advantage of Carthage's weakness to seize Sardinia and Corsica as well, extending its control over the islands of the Tyrrhenian Sea. For Rome, that victory represented a historic leap. In barely a generation, it had gone from being a local power of the Italian peninsula to becoming master of the seas and arbiter of the Western Mediterranean. The triumph strengthened its citizens' confidence in the Republic and cemented the belief that no sacrifice was too great in the service of the fatherland. For Carthage, however, the defeat was a devastating blow. It lost territories, wealth, and prestige. Its unpaid mercenaries rose in rebellion in Africa, in a bloody conflict that nearly destroyed the city itself. Carthaginian pride was deeply wounded, and resentment toward Rome became a common sentiment among its people. The city had survived, but at the cost of a humiliation it would never forget. Chapter 2: Hannibal's childhood and the siege of Saguntum. The bitter defeat of Carthage in the First Punic War had left the city sunk in humiliation. Losing Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, along with the enormous indemnities imposed by Rome, seemed to herald the final decline of what had once been the Queen of the Seas. But among the Carthaginian families, there was one that refused to accept defeat: the Barcids. At their head stood Hamilcar Barca, a general who had fought with tenacity in Sicily until the very last day of the war. Though forced to accept peace, he never regarded it as anything more than a truce. In his spirit burned the conviction that Rome was an implacable enemy, and that the day of revenge would surely come. Unlike many Carthaginian senators, wealthy merchants who preferred to maintain peace to safeguard their business, Hamilcar embodied military pride and the thirst for glory. It was he who, at the end of the war, conceived a bold plan to transfer Carthaginian power to Hispania. The peninsula offered immense riches, mines of silver and copper, fertile plains, warrior tribes that could become allies or mercenaries. From there, far from Rome's direct oversight, a new empire could be built and the ground prepared for a future confrontation. Hamilcar made no secret of it. Hispania would be the springboard from which he would avenge his homeland. Before departing, he staged an episode that would forever mark his son's life. Young Hannibal, barely 9 years old, was a bright child with an intense gaze who followed his father naturally, already drawn to the world of arms. Abbott recounts how Hamilcar led him to the altar of the Carthaginian gods to impose upon him a solemn oath. The general asked his son to place his hand upon the offering and pronounce the words that would seal his destiny. He would never be a friend of Rome. The boy obeyed, and with a firm voice promised eternal hatred toward the republic that had humiliated his homeland. That oath, sworn in childhood, became the compass of his entire life. From then on, Hannibal's education was that of the camp. He did not know the comfortable life of young Carthaginians in the metropolis, devoted to commerce or politics. His world was that of the soldiers, dark-skinned Africans, fierce-eyed Iberians, burly Gauls, and Numidians skilled in light cavalry. He learned their languages, their customs, their weapons. He rode horses with the skill of a Numidian, wielded the curved sword of the Iberians, endured hardships and privations like an ordinary soldier. This closeness earned him the loyalty of the troops, who saw him grow up among them, sharing their dangers and deprivations. The figure of Hamilcar inspired both respect and fear among the peoples of Hispania. With swift and decisive campaigns, he subdued tribes, forged alliances, and secured a dominion that once again made Carthage a feared power. But his life was cut short in an ambush, where he died fighting in Hispania. The loss was immense for his family and for the army, which saw in him the only man capable of leading Carthage to revenge. Command then passed to his son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, a man of great political skill. It was he who consolidated Carthaginian rule by founding the city of Carthaginian, later called Carthago Nova, which became the African capital in Hispania. Under his leadership, conquests continued, and Carthaginian power grew even stronger. But fortune again turned against them. Hasdrubal was assassinated, and the army, assembled in council, chose Hannibal by acclamation as his successor. He was only 25 years old, young, yet his charisma, energy, and precocious experience set him apart. The soldiers had seen him grow, had shared with him hardships and victories, and regarded him as one of their own. His election was unanimous and enthusiastic. From that moment, Hannibal became the very soul of Carthage's war effort. Rome watched warily. It knew this young man was no ordinary general. He was the son of Hamilcar, the boy who had sworn eternal hatred, and he would soon prove he was ready to fulfill that oath, choosing as his first target the city of Saguntum. The young Hannibal, newly chosen by the army to succeed Hasdrubal, wasted no time in showing that his character was forged for war. At only 25, he assumed command with a determination that surprised even the veterans. Unlike other commanders content to administer what had been conquered, he sought to expand, to advance, to challenge. His first objective was Saguntum, a city that, though located south of the Ebro River, and thus within the Carthaginian sphere according to prior agreements, maintained close ties with Rome. Saguntum was prosperous and proud. Its leaders, confident in Roman protection, refused to accept the authority of the Barcids. For Hannibal, tolerating such defiance was tantamount to acknowledging a shadow of Roman power in Hispania. He remembered the oath of his childhood and knew that confrontation was inevitable. He decided Saguntum would be the touchstone of his leadership and the prelude to a new war with Rome. The siege began with an impressive display. Hannibal gathered his army, composed of hardened Africans, warlike Iberians, Balearic slingers, and Numidian cavalry. He set up camps around the city and built engines of war, mobile towers, catapults, and battering rams. The walls of Saguntum, tall and solid, withstood the first assaults. The Saguntines, aware of what was at stake, fought with a ferocity equal to their enemies' determination. For months, the city held out. Rome, though informed of the danger, hesitated. The Senate debated endlessly. Some senators demanded immediate aid. Others feared that opening a front in Hispania would weaken Italy's defenses. Meanwhile, the Saguntines waited in vain for help from their supposed protectors. Roman politics, slow and calculating, condemned the city to face Carthage's power alone. The chronicles describe scenes of hunger and despair. The inhabitants consumed their reserves, sacrificed their beasts of burden, and even boiled leather and roots to survive. Disease and fatigue weakened the defenders, yet the hope that Rome would come to their aid kept their resistance alive. The fighting on the walls was savage. Every breach opened was defended by men and women determined to die rather than surrender. Hannibal, patient yet resolute, showed no compassion. He knew that this victory was not only militarily necessary, but also politically crucial. It would prove to Rome that Carthage still had generals capable of defying her, and that his own leadership was beyond question. He ordered continuous assaults, giving the defenders no respite. Little by little, the walls began to give way. Rome finally sent an embassy to Hannibal to demand that he abandon the siege. The young general listened to their words, but coldly replied that Saguntum lay within Carthaginian territory and that Rome had no right to interfere. The envoys returned to Rome empty-handed, and indignation in the city on the Tiber grew. The patience of the senators was running out. After 8 months of heroic resistance, Saguntum fell. The Carthaginian entry was brutal. The city was sacked, its defenders massacred, and the few survivors sold into slavery. For Hannibal, it was a resounding triumph. He had proven his command ability and struck at Roman pride where it hurt most, in the security of their allies. But that victory was also a declaration of war. In Rome, the news provoked fury. The Senate realized it could no longer ignore the son of Hamilcar. The Saguntines had trusted in Roman protection and had been abandoned to their fate. To allow their sacrifice to go unavenged would have meant admitting weakness. The honor of the Republic was at stake, and the response was swift. They sent an embassy to Carthage, bearing a clear ultimatum: hand over Hannibal or face war. The scene was memorable. The Roman envoy Fabius, addressing the Carthaginian Senate, lifted the fold of his toga and declared that within it he carried both peace and war, and that the Carthaginians must choose. The senators, proud, answered that he should open the toga and show what he bore. Fabius let the fold fall and pronounced firmly, "War." The Carthaginians responded with equal determination. So be it, war. The sacrifice of Saguntum had lit the spark that would soon engulf the Mediterranean in flames. The fall of Saguntum was not only a military victory for Hannibal, it was the proclamation of a destiny. With that blow, the young general presented himself to the world as the heir of Hamilcar's spirit, and as the relentless enemy of Rome. The Carthaginian city celebrated the triumph, but deep down it knew that the coming war would be far greater than anything it had ever faced. In Hispania, Hannibal moved quickly. He knew Rome would soon react, and that he had to consolidate his base before marching toward Italy. He traveled among the Iberian tribes, sealing pacts, securing loyalties, and quelling rebellions. His charisma and his knowledge of local customs made him a leader close to the Iberians themselves, who regarded him almost as one of their own. With promises of plunder and glory, he recruited thousands of warriors, men hardened by mountain life and constant war. The composition of his army reflected the mosaic of the Mediterranean world. African heavy infantry, hardened in the sands of the desert; Iberians, fierce in hand-to-hand combat; Balearic slingers, famed for their deadly accuracy; burly Gauls, untamed in spirit; Numidian cavalry, swift and agile as the wind. And alongside them, a contingent that would astonish Rome: war elephants, imposing beasts that symbolized both the strength and the exotic character of the Carthaginian armies. While preparing his forces, Hannibal pondered his strategy. He understood that confronting Rome on its own ground required audacity. A direct strike into Italy, across natural obstacles that seemed insurmountable, would be the masterstroke no one expected. But before executing that plan, he had to secure Hispania, both to supply resources and to prevent Rome from using the peninsula as a base of operations. Rome, for its part, reacted with the swiftness that characterized the Republic. The Senate decided to divide its forces in two. One army would be sent to Hispania to cut off the Barcid power there, and another would march on Africa if necessary. The consuls of that year, Publius Cornelius Scipio and Tiberius Sempronius Longus, were entrusted with command of the operations. The Roman war machine was set in motion, determined to crush its adversary before he could grow too strong. But Hannibal struck first. With rapid movements, he marched north, securing the Ebro Valley and defeating the tribes that resisted. His determination was clear. He would not stay in Hispania waiting for Rome's attack, but would take the war into the very heart of Italy. The audacity of such a plan unsettled even his own officers, but Hannibal's authority was unquestionable. His youth was balanced by a natural talent for command, tireless energy, and an unshakable confidence in his destiny. Abbott describes how, in those months, Hannibal consolidated his army and prepared the ground for the enterprise that would make him immortal: the crossing of the Alps. The oath he had sworn in childhood guided his every decision. Rome had destroyed Saguntum, had humiliated Carthage, and now it would pay the price. When news of the sack reached Rome, the clamor for war was unanimous. The senators knew that the conflict now beginning would not be like the one before. It was no longer about Sicily or a lost ally. It was a direct challenge, embodied in a young and daring general who would not stop until Rome was subdued or destroyed. Thus, while Rome gathered its legions and Carthage placed its hopes in the genius of its commander, the Mediterranean braced for the second great clash. The waters were calm, but over them loomed the storm. And at the center of that storm rose the figure of Hannibal Barca, the boy who had sworn eternal hatred, and who now, as a general, was ready to fulfill his promise. Chapter 3: The beginning of the Second Punic War. The fall of Saguntum was the spark that ignited the second great conflagration between Rome and Carthage. As soon as the news reached the Roman Senate, the outrage was unanimous. This was no longer about Sicily or commercial disputes. An ally had been destroyed with fire and blood, openly defying Rome's authority. The senators understood that they could not ignore such an insult without endangering the prestige and security of the Republic. Thus, war was officially declared. Roman strategy was quickly defined. Two armies would be sent simultaneously against Carthage to divide its forces. Publius Cornelius Scipio, father of the future Scipio Africanus, was given command of an expedition to Hispania, with the goal of cutting off the Barcid base of power in the peninsula. Tiberius Sempronius Longus, on the other hand, would march to Sicily, and from there prepare the invasion of Africa. With this plan, Rome hoped to force the Carthaginians to fight on two fronts, weakening them until they were compelled to surrender. But Hannibal, far from waiting passively for the attack, had already conceived a plan that would astonish the world. His idea was so audacious it seemed close to madness: to take the war directly into Italy. Instead of limiting himself to defending Hispania or holding out in Africa, he intended to cross all of Gaul and march over the Alps with his army, to appear before the walls of Rome from the very heart of the peninsula. It was a colossal undertaking. The Alps were regarded as an impassable barrier, a wall of stone and snow separating the Mediterranean from the barbarian world of the north. The routes were treacherous, the climates deadly, and the mountain tribes hostile. But precisely in that difficulty lay the brilliance of the plan. Rome would never expect it. While the senators calculated how to confront Carthage in Hispania and Africa, Hannibal was already preparing the strike that would put all of Italy in peril. The Carthaginian general knew that such a risky plan required meticulous preparation. First, he secured his rear in Hispania. He left his brother Hasdrubal in command of the Carthaginian troops and the administration of the conquered territories, with clear instructions to maintain the loyalty of the tribes and to contain any Roman offensive. Then he set about gathering an army strong enough for the enterprise. The diversity of his troops reflected the breadth of Carthaginian dominion: African heavy infantry, disciplined and resilient; impetuous Iberians skilled with the falcata; Balearic slingers, famed for hurling stones with lethal force at great distances; Gauls recruited in earlier campaigns, terrifying for their ferocity; and the Numidian cavalry, light and swift, capable of harassing and disorganizing any foe. To this mosaic were added the war elephants, gigantic beasts that inspired terror in adversaries and served as a symbol of Carthaginian power. With this army, Hannibal began his march northward. The first obstacle was the Ebro River, the natural frontier between Carthaginian domains and the territories Rome considered under its protection. To cross it meant an open act of defiance, the first step toward total war. Hannibal crossed without hesitation, defeating the tribes that tried to oppose him and subduing the peoples along its banks. Abbott describes how this advance was not only a military operation, but also a demonstration of his genius as both politician and strategist. Wherever possible, he struck alliances with local tribes, offering pacts and promises of plunder. Wherever he met resistance, he struck hard, imposing obedience. Step by step, he carved a path toward Gaul, determined to force the Alps and appear in Italy like an unexpected spectre. The march into Gaul was, in itself, a feat. Hannibal had to lead a heterogeneous army, tens of thousands of men, horses, pack mules, and a contingent of elephants, through hostile and unknown lands. The Romans trusted that the distance, the terrain, and the Gallic tribes would be insurmountable obstacles, but the Carthaginian general proved a unique combination of audacity and diplomacy. Upon entering southern Gaul, Hannibal encountered immediate resistance. Several tribes, fearful of losing their independence, opposed his passage. Some had received promises of Roman support and were determined to prevent the foreign army from crossing their lands. The clashes were intense: ambushes in narrow passes, swift attacks on supply convoys, skirmishes along riverbanks. Each battle wore down the Carthaginians, but it also solidified the reputation of their commander. When force was not enough, Hannibal turned to persuasion. He knew how to address tribal chiefs, how to offer gifts, alliances, or the prospect of sharing in Italy's plunder. On more than one occasion, he convinced entire communities to let him pass, sparing his army costly fights. His charisma and his ability to grasp the motivations of each people proved as decisive as the sword. The crossing of the Rhone River marked a memorable episode in the campaign. The Rhone was broad and swift, difficult to cross even for light travelers, and Hannibal had to bring across tens of thousands of men, horses, and elephants. The Gauls had gathered on the opposite bank, prepared to block the crossing. With his characteristic ingenuity, the Carthaginian devised a stratagem. He sent part of his troops upstream to build rafts and cross by night, while he prepared the main crossing. At dawn, when the Gauls hurled themselves against the main force, they were taken by surprise by the unexpected attack from their rear. Disorganized, they fled, and Hannibal's army succeeded in passing the river. The crossing of the elephants was a spectacle etched into the memory of all who witnessed it. The enormous beasts, terrified of the water, were led across on improvised platforms and rafts, covered with earth to trick them. Though several were lost to the current, most managed to reach the opposite bank, inspiring awe and fear among the Gallic tribes who had never before seen such creatures. The advance continued eastward, with the shadow of the Alps drawing ever closer. For the Carthaginian soldiers, the sight of those snow-covered mountains must have seemed more like a wall than a path. Accounts spoke of narrow trails, deadly precipices, eternal snows, and savage tribes attacking travelers from the heights. Many officers advised Hannibal to abandon the impossible plan, to return to Hispania or face Rome on other ground. But he remained resolute. Abbott emphasizes how Hannibal knew how to inspire his men in those moments of doubt. He reminded them that the greatest glory is won in the most perilous undertakings, that the enemy expected peace in Italy, and that nothing would be more devastating to Rome than the sudden appearance of a Carthaginian army at its very gates. He spoke with passion, promising rewards, lands, and plunder. The soldiers, weary but enthralled by the energy of their leader, agreed to follow him. As they approached the foothills of the Alps, the environment grew increasingly hostile. Tribe after tribe blocked their path, some offering deceitful hospitality, others attacking without mercy. In a narrow pass, the Carthaginians fell into a bloody ambush from the heights, where showers of stones and arrows wreaked havoc. Hannibal reacted swiftly, deploying his troops and counter-attacking until he carved a passage through. Each victory, though costly, reinforced the army's confidence in the almost superhuman ability of their commander. At last, the army reached the slopes of the Alps. Before them loomed the greatest natural barrier in Europe, a challenge that until then seemed reserved for the gods. What was about to unfold would be remembered for centuries as one of the most incredible feats in military history. Hannibal's army, after weeks of fighting and negotiating in Gaul, finally reached the Alps. Before them rose a wall of stone and snow, with peaks that seemed to touch the sky and passes that provoked vertigo. No one in their right mind would have attempted to cross such terrain with tens of thousands of men, horses, pack animals, and elephants. But Hannibal did not hesitate. Glory lay on the other side of the mountains, in the plains of Italy, and there could be no turning back. The ascent began with immediate hardships. The paths were narrow and treacherous. A column of soldiers could take hours to advance only a few kilometers. Supplies were scarce, the air cold and thin, and snow blanketed the trails, concealing deadly traps. At times, a single misstep sent men and animals plunging into the abyss. Fatigue and fear spread, but Hannibal rode along the column on horseback, or went on foot, encouraging his troops with words and with his own example. The mountain tribes proved even more dangerous than snow and ice. Masters of the terrain, they attacked from the heights of cliffs, hurling stones, logs, and arrows onto the Carthaginians struggling along narrow passes. More than once, the ambushes caused heavy losses. Abbott recounts how the mountaineers feigned friendship, offering guides and provisions, only to betray the foreigners at their most vulnerable points. Hannibal, cautious, combined diplomacy with force. He accepted truces when necessary, but punished mercilessly any attempt at treachery. The crossing was not only a military challenge, but also a logistical one. The engineers improvised roads, cut through rocks, and filled crevices with wood and stones, so the elephants could pass. At one especially perilous point, a landslide blocked the route, forcing the army to carve a new path directly into the living rock. The days passed in a succession of snowstorms, tribal attacks, and constant losses. Hunger and cold became as deadly as the Romans themselves. Weakened soldiers fed on whatever they could find: herbs, strips of bark, the flesh of fallen horses. Morale crumbled, and many began to murmur that the endeavor was impossible. But Hannibal, with inexhaustible energy, kept them together. He walked among them, shared their hardships, and constantly reminded them of the oath that guided him: the destruction of Rome. At last, after more than 2 weeks of unspeakable suffering, the army reached the summit. There Hannibal gathered his men, and with his arm outstretched, pointed toward the green plains of Italy, opening on the horizon under the autumn sun. He promised them that those fertile lands would be the reward for their sacrifices, that soon they would descend into abundance and victory. The vision renewed the spirit of the troops. The descent, however, proved even more dangerous than the climb. The frozen paths sent men and animals sliding into the void. Many horses, mules, and elephants were lost in horrifying falls. The army endured terrible losses. Tens of thousands had departed from Hispania, but upon reaching the plains of Piedmont, only some 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry remained, accompanied by roughly 30 elephants. And yet, they had accomplished the impossible. They had crossed the Alps, something even the Romans had never thought feasible. The ancient world stood in awe. A Carthaginian general had brought war into the heart of Italy, defying nature itself. Abbott notes that, though reduced and exhausted, Hannibal's army emerged from the crossing hardened and united. Every soldier who had survived felt part of an unprecedented feat, and at their head, the young general had become a living legend. The Roman Republic, confident it could stop the Carthaginians in Hispania or Africa, suddenly discovered that the enemy was in its own house. Italy was about to become the stage for a war unlike anything it had ever known. Chapter 4. The First Battles in Northern Italy. When the Carthaginians finally descended from the mountains and set foot on the plains of the Po Valley, the ancient world held its breath. The army was reduced, exhausted, with gaunt faces and garments torn from weeks of cold and hunger. Yet those men had become hardened survivors, soldiers who had endured the harshest trial an army can face. Their arrival in Italy was an unprecedented event. Rome, stunned by the audacity of the enemy, mobilized quickly. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, who had set out for Hispania to cut off Carthaginian bases, received the news that Hannibal was already in Italy. He immediately returned with his troops and advanced north to confront him. The first clash took place on the banks of the river Ticinus, a tributary of the Po. There, cavalry played the decisive role. Hannibal deployed his Numidian horsemen and Iberian cavalry, while Scipio relied on his Gallic allies and Roman horsemen. The battle was swift and fierce. The Numidians, with their speed and skill in harassing the enemy, clearly outmatched the Romans. They attacked and withdrew with dexterity, hurling javelins and charging again before the heavy cavalry could respond. In a short time, the Roman riders were surrounded and thrown into disarray. Amid the chaos, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the consul, was wounded and nearly killed on the battlefield. It was his son, a youth of barely 17, who heroically rescued him and carried him safely out of the fight. That young man was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the future Scipio Africanus, destined to become Hannibal's greatest rival and, in the end, his conqueror. Thus destiny bound together two figures who would mark history: the Carthaginian, who had sworn eternal hatred of Rome, and the Roman, who would one day defeat him. After the victory at the Ticinus, Hannibal consolidated his position in the Po Valley. His arrival ignited the enthusiasm of many Gallic tribes, resentful of Rome after decades of domination. The Gauls saw in him a liberator and joined his ranks in great numbers, significantly enlarging his army. It was a political triumph as much as a military one. Hannibal was not only defeating the Romans on the battlefield, but also undermining their alliances within Italy. Alarmed, Rome sent reinforcements. The other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, was in Sicily and was summoned at once to confront the threat in the north. With his arrival, the Romans assembled an army larger than Hannibal's, and both sides prepared for a greater confrontation. The stage would be the river Trebia. Meanwhile, Hannibal used every moment to strengthen his position. He nourished the morale of his troops by reminding them of the epic of the Alps, presenting that crossing as proof that the gods were on their side. He also knew how to win over the Gauls with generosity and promises of plunder. The combination of diplomacy, charisma, and military audacity turned his army into a cohesive force, despite its diversity. Rome, by contrast, trusted in its numerical superiority and the discipline of its legions. The coming battle at the Trebia would be the first great test between the two armies on Italian soil. The winter of 218 BC settled over the Po Valley as Hannibal and the Romans prepared for a decisive clash. After the skirmish at the Ticinus, Rome was determined to stop the invader once and for all. Consul Tiberius Sempronius Longus, eager for glory, assembled a formidable army and sought battle quickly. Hannibal, however, understood that Roman impatience could be his best ally. The chosen place was the river Trebia, a swollen and icy torrent. Hannibal devised a stratagem worthy of his genius. to lure the Romans into crossing the river under unfavorable conditions while laying an ambush. For this, he ordered his brother Mago to conceal himself with a picked detachment of cavalry and light troops in a ravine thick with brush near the battlefield. There they would remain hidden until the decisive moment. On the morning of battle, Hannibal sent his Numidian cavalry to harass the Roman camp. Sempronius, eager to confront the enemy and confident in his numerical superiority, fell into the trap. He ordered his troops to march out hastily and cross the river Trebia. The water was icy, and the Roman soldiers waded through up to their chests, soaked and shivering with cold. By the time they reached the opposite bank, they were already weakened and disorganized. Hannibal, who was waiting prepared, launched his attack. In the center he placed his African and Iberian infantry, disciplined and resilient. On the flanks he stationed his cavalry, with the Numidians ready to envelop the Romans. The elephants, though few, added an element of terror at the front. The clash was brutal. The Romans fought bravely, but the fatigue from the river and the cold sapped their strength. At the decisive moment, Mago and his hidden troops emerged from the ravine and struck from the rear. It was the fatal blow. Trapped between the river, the Carthaginian infantry, the encircling cavalry, and Mago's ambush, the Romans found themselves surrounded. The fight turned into a slaughter. Thousands of legionaries fell beneath Carthaginian spears, swords, and javelins. The few who managed to escape did so in complete disorder, pursued relentlessly by the Numidian horsemen. The victory was total for Hannibal. Rome had lost tens of thousands of men in a single day. Abbott notes that the disaster was all the more humiliating because the Romans had brought it upon themselves with their impatience, while Hannibal had shown cold calculation and mastery in execution. The reputation of the young general soared. Not only had he crossed the Alps, but he had already defeated 2 consuls in open battle in less than a year. The consequences were profound. Numerous Gallic tribes, seeing Rome's weakness, joined Hannibal, swelling his army with thousands of new warriors. Northern Italy began to tilt toward Carthage. In Rome, the news provoked consternation. For the first time, the Republic realized it faced a different kind of enemy, a strategist capable of turning every weakness into strength and every Roman mistake into disaster. The Battle of the Trebia was more than a victory. It was proof that Hannibal had not come to Italy for a mere raid, but to wage a prolonged war on Roman soil. The boy who had sworn eternal hatred of Rome had already become the Republic's living nightmare. Chapter 5: The Apennine Campaign and the Battle of Lake Trasimene. After the victory at the river Trebia, Hannibal knew he could not stop. Every day that passed strengthened Rome's morale and gave the Republic time to raise new legions. The key to his strategy was to keep the initiative, striking again and again until the confidence of his enemies wavered. To do this, he had to cross the Apennines, a mountain chain which, though less lofty than the Alps, posed immense difficulties, especially in winter. The march was a torment. Relentless rains turned the paths into rivers of mud. The Carthaginians entered swampy plains where the water reached up to their knees, forcing the men to slog forward exhausted, unable to light fires to dry their clothes or cook their food. Horses sank in the mire, many dying trapped. Pack animals collapsed one after another, leaving the army with ever fewer supplies. Even the elephants, survivors of the epic Alpine crossing, fell in the marshes, unable to endure further. Hunger and disease took a grim toll. Abbott describes how the constant dampness produced fevers that weakened the soldiers. The nights were unbearable. With no shelter from the rain, the army slept on waterlogged ground, wrapped in soaked cloaks. Each day the men rose more exhausted, yet they kept marching because their general marched beside them. Hannibal himself fell victim to an eye infection that left him blind in one eye, yet he never allowed his soldiers to see him falter. He continued moving along the ranks, on horseback or on foot, sharing the hardships and urging them to endure. His ability to inspire confidence in the midst of suffering was the main reason the army did not disintegrate on that hellish march. The sight of their general, bearing the same privations, kept morale alive. The losses were enormous. It is estimated that thousands of men perished in that crossing, along with most of the pack animals and nearly all of the elephants. And yet, the survivors emerged from the swamps hardened in spirit. They had endured trials no other army in the Mediterranean could have survived. That resilience, forged in adversity, became the hallmark of Hannibal's army, a seal of iron, reminding them that if they had survived this, they could survive anything. Rome, upon learning of the crossing, understood it faced a different kind of enemy. The Alps had been overcome, and now the Apennines as well. Neither mountains, nor storms, nor hunger had stopped the Carthaginian. The senators looked on in horror as the enemy drew ever closer to the heart of Italy, unstoppable, as though guided by the gods themselves. As Hannibal emerged from the swamps of the Apennines with his army reduced but strengthened in spirit, alarm in Rome reached its peak. The Republic had already seen tens of thousands fall at Trebia, and now the enemy was marching unchallenged through Etruria, only a few days from the capital itself. The Senate, true to custom, appointed 2 new consuls for the year 217 BC, Gaius Flaminius and Gnaeus Servilius. The defense of Rome now lay in their hands. Of the 2, it was Flaminius who first came into contact with the Carthaginian. Abbott describes him as a man of great energy, but dominated by vanity and impatience. He had risen in politics with a populist style, often clashing with the aristocracy of the Senate. Courage he did not lack, but his impetuous nature made him distrust counsel and act on impulse. For a strategist like Hannibal, that was a dangerous weakness to exploit. The Carthaginian understood that the best way to draw Flaminius into a trap was to provoke his pride. With this aim, he launched a calculated campaign of devastation. He advanced through Etruria, burning villages, sacking villas, destroying crops. Every column of smoke was a direct challenge hurled at the Roman consul. Peasants fled in terror, and news of the atrocities reached Rome daily. The people clamored for revenge, and Flaminius, aware of the political pressure, burned with desire to face the enemy. Prudence advised waiting, gathering reinforcements, coordinating action with his colleague Servilius. But Flaminius would not listen. Afraid Rome might accuse him of cowardice and ambitious for a victory that would secure him immortal glory, he decided to launch an immediate pursuit. The Roman army marched after Hannibal with reckless enthusiasm, convinced that this time they would force the Carthaginian into open battle. Hannibal, meanwhile, had carefully chosen the place where he wished to strike: Lake Trasimene. It was a narrow, elongated valley, with the lake closing off one exit and wooded hills enclosing the road. There, the terrain itself became the perfect ally for an ambush. During the night, the Carthaginian deployed his forces with precision. He concealed his heavy infantry in the wooded slopes, invisible from the road. Elsewhere he hid light cavalry and slingers, ready to descend upon the enemy at the right moment. At the narrowest part of the valley, he placed a detachment meant to lure the Romans deeper inside. Every soldier knew his position. Every unit awaited the signal to attack. Morning fog blanketed the valley, thick and silent. The Romans, confident and led by an impatient consul, advanced into the gorge without scouting the ground or sending forward reconnaissance. Flaminius, blinded by rage and ambition, thought only of catching and destroying the enemy. He never imagined it was he who was about to walk into the web Hannibal had woven with such patience. On the hillsides, thousands of Carthaginians waited in silence, hidden among trees and rocks, scarcely breathing to avoid discovery. It was the calm before the storm. The Roman army marched straight into the trap, while Hannibal, watching from above, awaited the exact moment to unleash disaster. Dawn in the valley of Trasimene was slow and misty. A thick fog covered the hills and the lake, hiding everything beyond a few steps. For Hannibal, it was the perfect stage. His troops remained in absolute silence, concealed among trees and thickets, waiting for the agreed signal. The Carthaginian had arranged his men with a precision that revealed his genius. The African and Iberian infantry occupied the slopes, the Numidian cavalry waited poised to strike from the flanks, and a lighter contingent blocked the exit of the valley. Everything was ready to trap the Romans as if in an iron cage. Gaius Flaminius, meanwhile, marched convinced he was about to catch the enemy. He sent no scouts, made no reconnaissance of the ground. The fog, which should have inspired caution, emboldened him further, for he believed he could surprise Hannibal in retreat. His army advanced in a long, disordered column, pressing into the narrow corridor beside the lake. Neither officers nor soldiers suspected that on the hills surrounding them, tens of thousands of enemies lay watching. Suddenly, the signal sounded. Abbott recounts how, at once, the Carthaginians hurled themselves forward with a deafening roar. The blare of trumpets, the cries of war, the clash of weapons shattered the silence of the fog. For the Romans, the assault was like a blow struck out of nowhere. Before they could form their lines, they were already under attack from the front, the rear, and both flanks. Confusion reigned. The fog made it impossible to distinguish friend from foe, and the narrow terrain offered no room to deploy the legions properly. The Carthaginians, who knew every position, fell upon them with absolute advantage. The Numidian cavalry, swift and ferocious, struck at those who tried to flee. The Iberian and Gallic infantry, wild and impetuous, shattered Roman formations. The Africans, steady and disciplined, closed the trap. Flaminius tried to maintain order, but soon found himself surrounded. He fought bravely, sword in hand, until he was cut down in the melee. The consul's fall sealed the fate of his men. Deprived of their leader, the legions collapsed completely. Thousands were slaughtered in the field, while others fled desperately toward the lake. Some tried to swim across but drowned under the weight of their armor. Others were pursued and captured. The numbers were appalling. It is estimated that more than 15,000 Romans died that day, and another 10,000 were taken prisoner. The ambush at Lake Trasimene was one of the greatest defeats in Roman history, not only for the scale of losses, but for the manner in which they were inflicted. Roman pride was crushed in a matter of hours by the cunning of a single man. When the news reached Rome, the consternation was absolute. The city was seized with panic, fearing Hannibal would march directly upon its walls. But the Carthaginian did not rush. He knew he still needed to reinforce his army and consolidate alliances. He had achieved something even greater than a military triumph. He had sown terror in the very heart of the Republic. Lake Trasimene was etched forever in Roman memory as a symbol of disaster. For Hannibal, it was confirmation that his genius could overcome not only armies, but also the pride and confidence of Rome itself. The boy who had once sworn eternal hatred at his father's altar had just inflicted one of the worst blows in history upon his sworn enemy. Chapter 6. The Dictator Fabius. The news of the catastrophe at Lake Trasimene fell upon Rome like a thunderbolt in the darkness. The city plunged into panic. Never before in living memory had the Republic suffered such a devastating defeat. A consul slain, tens of thousands of legionaries annihilated or captured, and a foreign enemy advancing unopposed through the heart of Italy. The temples filled with people imploring the gods, families wept for their dead, and in the Senate reigned a mixture of consternation and fury. Many feared that Hannibal's next step would be to march directly upon the city walls. The vision of Carthaginian elephants at the gates of the Forum no longer seemed a fantasy, but a real possibility. In such circumstances, Rome turned to an extreme measure, reserved only for moments when the Republic stood at the brink of destruction: the appointment of a dictator. The dictator was not a tyrant in the modern sense of the word, but an extraordinary magistrate, chosen to concentrate all the powers of the state for a limited time, with the aim of saving the fatherland in moments of emergency. The Senate and the people agreed that what was needed now was a single voice of command, someone able to act with speed and authority, free from the usual disputes of Roman politics. The man chosen was Quintus Fabius Maximus, an elderly patrician with long political and military experience. He was not a brilliant general, nor a dazzling orator, but a man of sober character, reflective and prudent. Abbott describes him as someone who inspired respect more through serenity than through energy. In the past, he had held important magistracies, and his reputation for wisdom made him suited to times of crisis. The choice of Fabius was met with relief by some and skepticism by others. Rome was accustomed to leaders who sought glory through swift and spectacular victories. But Fabius was not a man of impulse. His nature inclined him toward caution, patient observation, and calculation. Against an enemy as unpredictable and audacious as Hannibal, such prudence could be as much a virtue as a flaw. Upon assuming office, Fabius found a republic gripped by terror and an army stripped of morale. His first task was to restore confidence. He ordered solemn sacrifices to the gods, organized new levies, and assured the people that Rome, though wounded, was not defeated. With his calm presence and measured words, he managed to restore a minimum of hope to the populace. Yet the true test would come on the battlefield. From the moment he assumed command, Fabius understood that to face Hannibal in a pitched battle was suicide. The recent examples showed it with brutal clarity. Trebia and Lake Trasimene were bloody reminders of what happened when Rome rushed to fight the Carthaginian on his own terms. For this reason, Fabius decided to break with Roman military tradition. Instead of seeking glory in a frontal clash, he chose a far slower, more calculated method: to wear the enemy down. The strategy was to avoid open confrontations, and instead shadow Hannibal's movements, never allowing him the chance to win another decisive victory. The Roman army, under his orders, marched parallel to the Carthaginian host, always close enough to watch, but never risking direct engagement. Fabius ordered roads cut, bridges destroyed, mountain passes occupied before the enemy arrived. He also ensured that supplies which might fall into Carthaginian hands were destroyed, while safeguarding provisions for his own army. It was, in essence, a war of attrition, where patience was the chief weapon. Abbott notes that Fabius understood Hannibal, far from his homeland, and with limited resources, relied on swift victories to sustain his army. If he were denied that satisfaction and forced to march constantly, raiding and scouring for supplies, sooner or later his forces would weaken. Hannibal's reaction was one of frustration. Accustomed to exploiting Roman impatience, he now found himself facing an enemy who refused to play by his rules. He tried to provoke the dictator by devastating territories before his very eyes, burning villas and plundering towns. He even attempted to lure him into traps, feigning retreats, or leaving apparent opportunities for attack, but Fabius never took the bait. He observed, he waited, and he stood firm in his decision not to risk everything. This tactic earned Fabius a nickname that would pass into history: Cunctator, the delayer. His enemies used it as mockery, but he bore it with pride, convinced that only delay could save Rome. The people, however, did not see it the same way. Romans were accustomed to the idea of swift victory and immediate glory. The population suffered as their fields were ravaged, while the army, under Fabius, seemed to stand by and do nothing. Many accused him of cowardice, of lacking spirit, even of treason. The Senate was divided, and though some recognized the prudence of his plan, impatience grew by the day. Even so, Fabius persevered. He was convinced that, though unpopular, his strategy was the only one capable of saving Rome from the Carthaginian genius. In the struggle between Hannibal's audacity and Fabius's patience, the fate of Italy hung in a delicate balance. The strategy of Fabius, though prudent and effective, soon became unpopular in Rome. The people, accustomed to measuring glory by swift victories and trophies displayed in the Forum, could not understand how such a large army merely shadowed Hannibal without fighting him. Each time peasants returned with tales of villages burned, crops destroyed, and families forced to flee, the clamor against the dictator grew louder. Many accused him of cowardice, others of being bought with Carthaginian gold. In the Senate, division was evident. One faction recognized that after the defeats at Trebia and Trasimene, Rome could not risk another catastrophe. The caution of Fabius seemed the only barrier containing Hannibal's advance. But another faction, fueled by the people's impatience, clamored for open battle to cleanse Rome's dishonor and punish the invader. Political pressure mounted, and Fabius found himself increasingly isolated. Hannibal, for his part, knew how to exploit this impatience. He deployed all his ingenuity to provoke the dictator and undermine his authority. He ravaged territories before his very eyes, confident that the Romans would grow indignant at seeing their army stand idle. In a famous episode, he even devastated lands belonging to Fabius himself, hoping that wounded pride would drive him into battle. But the dictator stood firm, showing that he would not be swayed by anger. Even so, the discontent became unbearable. When Fabius returned to Rome to perform religious rites, he left his second-in-command in charge. Pressured by officers and eager for glory, this deputy abandoned the dictator's tactics and confronted Hannibal in battle. The result was a disaster. The Romans suffered heavy losses and avoided total annihilation only thanks to the coming of night. The episode confirmed the wisdom of Fabius, but also revealed the difficulty of sustaining his strategy in a society that worshipped action and despised patience. In time, the dictator's mandate expired, and Rome returned to its normal leadership of 2 consuls, yet the mark of Fabius endured. Though criticized and mocked, he had achieved what seemed impossible, containing Hannibal at the most dangerous moment of the war. His method offered no spectacular victories, but it spared Rome from immediate destruction. Abbott concludes that the policy of Fabius was, in essence, a bitter lesson for the Romans, that impatience was the weapon Hannibal best knew how to turn against them, and that only perseverance and endurance could balance the scales. The nickname Cunctator, the delayer, born as a jeer, in time became a title of honor. Rome learned, however reluctantly, that sometimes prudence saves more republics than reckless valor. Chapter 7. The Battle of Cannae. The year 216 BC marked a decisive point in the war. Rome, humiliated by the defeats at Trebia and Trasimene, could no longer bear the pressure of seeing Hannibal's army move unopposed across Italy. The people clamored for a victory that would erase the disgrace, and the senators feared that confidence in the Republic would collapse if the enemy was not faced once and for all. Under that pressure, Rome decided to raise the largest army in its history. Nearly 80,000 infantry and more than 6,000 cavalry were recruited, along with allied contingents from all over Italy. It was a colossal force, intended not only to defeat Hannibal, but to annihilate him completely. 2 consuls took command, as was customary, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The first, cautious and sympathetic to Fabius's ideas, understood the risks of confronting Hannibal on open ground. The second, by contrast, was impetuous, confident in Rome's numerical superiority and eager for personal glory. The alternating daily command of the consuls, inherent in the Roman system, made their strategy even more fragile. The battlefield chosen was the plain of Cannae, in Apulia, a fertile region that supplied much of Italy with grain. Hannibal had occupied the site precisely to force Rome to defend it. The wind, heavy with dust and heat, swept across the open plain. There, under the blazing summer sun, a battle was about to unfold that would pass into history as a masterpiece of military strategy. The disposition of the armies reflected the difference in conception between the two adversaries. The Romans, confident in their numbers, formed a massive, compact block of infantry in the center, their cohorts packed tightly together to smash through with brute force. Their cavalry, fewer in number, was split on the flanks, expected to hold long enough for the infantry to decide the contest. Hannibal, on the other hand, deployed his troops with a plan as daring as it was risky. In the center he placed his weakest soldiers, Spaniards and Gauls, brave but less disciplined, arrayed in a convex line that bulged outward toward the enemy. On each side he stationed his elite African infantry, hardened veterans, armed with equipment captured from the Romans themselves, ready to close the trap at the opportune moment. The Carthaginian cavalry, superior in both number and quality, was placed on the flanks, heavy Iberian cavalry on one side, swift Numidians on the other. Abbott emphasizes that Hannibal's genius lay in this very deployment. He was willing to sacrifice the resistance of his center in order to draw the immense Roman mass inward into a carefully designed trap. Rome trusted that its overwhelming infantry would force a breakthrough. Hannibal planned to turn that confidence into their ruin. On the morning of battle, the two armies confronted each other beneath a blazing sun. The legions advanced to the sound of trumpets and drums, a tide of steel and shields that seemed unstoppable. Opposite them, Hannibal waited calmly. He knew that this day would decide not only the fate of his army, but perhaps that of the entire Mediterranean world. When the clash began on the plain of Cannae, the dust raised by thousands of feet and hooves darkened the horizon. The Romans, with their legions packed tightly together, advanced like a living wall, confident that their numbers alone would crush any resistance. The Carthaginian center, composed of Iberians and Gauls, received the impact bravely, but slowly began to give ground. To Roman eyes, it seemed that victory was within reach. Their massive formation pressed forward, forcing the enemy to yield. Yet what appeared as weakness was part of Hannibal's design. The Carthaginian center bent backward, gradually transforming from a convex arc into a concave one. The legionaries, with their relentless push, advanced deeper and deeper into the pocket that was forming. Their very strength and confidence drew them into the trap. Meanwhile, on the flanks, the battle took on another tone. The Carthaginian cavalry, superior in number and quality, charged against the Roman horse. On one side, the heavy Hispanic and Iberian cavalry crashed violently into the Roman riders. The struggle was brief and bloody. The Romans, inferior in discipline and equipment, were quickly overwhelmed. On the other flank, the Numidians, with unmatched mobility, harried Rome's allied cavalry, hurling javelins and retreating swiftly only to charge again. In short order, both Roman flanks collapsed, leaving the Carthaginian cavalry free to maneuver. Abbott describes how, once mastery of the flanks was secured, the Carthaginian cavalry swung toward the Roman rear. The Republican army, fixated on driving back the enemy center, did not realize it was being encircled. Dust and heat compounded the confusion. Roman officers, convinced of their apparent advantage in the center, failed to grasp that they were marching ever deeper into a mortal snare. The Carthaginian center continued to give ground slowly, fighting with ferocity, yet retreating in controlled fashion. The Iberians and Gauls fell in great numbers, but every minute they held was vital for Hannibal's plan. They were the bait, the sacrifice that kept the strongest core of the Roman army occupied. Behind them, the African infantry awaited the signal to strike. Roman pressure was immense. The cohorts surged forward, shoving one another, every man caught in a tide of bodies and spears. Space grew tighter, the air stifling, and visibility was scarce amid dust and sweat. The Roman army, instead of keeping its flexibility, compressed into a rigid block, stripped of maneuverability, exactly as Hannibal had foreseen. At that crucial moment, the Carthaginian gave the signal. The African infantry wings, fresh and disciplined, advanced from the flanks against the exposed sides of the Roman mass. The trap was almost closed. The legionaries, who until then had felt dominant, began to realize they were surrounded. The Battle of Cannae was entering its decisive phase. The decisive moment had come. When the African infantry struck from the flanks against the Roman sides, the compact mass of legionaries was caught in a deadly pincer. The Carthaginian center, which until then had been falling back, suddenly held firm with renewed strength. The Romans, who had advanced believing themselves victorious, discovered at once that there was no escape. It was then that the Carthaginian cavalry, triumphant on the flanks, completed the masterpiece. After annihilating the Roman horse, the Numidian and Iberian riders burst into the enemy rear. The trap was now fully closed, a ring of steel and spears, encircling tens of thousands of men. Abbott describes in detail the horror that followed. The legionaries, packed into an ever-shrinking space, could scarcely wield their weapons. Each Roman soldier was hemmed in on all sides by comrades, pushed forward by the pressure of the crowd, and at the same time crushed by the Carthaginian assault from the flanks. The combat degenerated into a slaughter without order or formation. Men fell and were trampled by their own fellows, others fought blindly, striking without seeing the foe. Roman discipline, so often admired, became useless under such conditions. Numerical superiority, instead of being an advantage, turned into a death sentence. It was an army too large, trapped in a space too narrow, reduced to a helpless multitude that could only endure while death rained upon them from every side. The massacre lasted for hours. The summer heat and the dust of the battlefield shrouded everything in a suffocating veil. The Carthaginians, fighting with determination, calmly executed the destruction of their enemy's army. One by one, the Roman standards disappeared beneath the tide of bodies. Consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus himself fell fighting bravely, refusing to flee. Many senior officers perished with him, and among the dead were dozens of senators who had joined the campaign. When the sun began to sink, the battle was over. It is estimated that between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died at Cannae, while some 10,000 were taken prisoner. The loss was so immense it surpassed any previous disaster in Rome's history. It was absolute defeat, the near-total destruction of a consular army. The consequences were immediate. Many cities of southern Italy, fearing Hannibal's might, defected to his side. Capua, the second city of the peninsula, opened its gates to the Carthaginian. Even foreign kingdoms, such as Macedonia, began considering alliances with him. The Republic seemed on the verge of collapse, and yet Rome did not surrender. The Senate rejected all negotiations of peace and swore to continue the fight. It was an act of pride and of desperation, but also the seed of future resistance. For Hannibal, Cannae was the pinnacle of his military genius. He had inflicted upon his enemy the perfect defeat, still studied today as a model of tactics. But even at the height of glory, the Carthaginian would soon discover that no victory, however great, was enough to break the will of Rome. Chapter 8. The Years of Hannibal's Stalemate. After the colossal victory at Cannae, Hannibal stood at the height of his glory. He had destroyed the largest army Rome had ever assembled. Tens of thousands of legionaries lay dead on the field, and all Italy trembled at his name. Several cities in the south, including the powerful Capua, gave themselves to him as allies. Other peoples, weary of Roman domination, sent envoys to negotiate. On the surface, the road to Rome seemed open, but here begins the paradox that Abbott underscores with clarity. Despite being at the pinnacle of his power, Hannibal could not deliver the final blow. Many in posterity wondered why he did not march directly on Rome after Cannae. The answer lies not in lack of audacity, but in the harsh reality of his army and resources. A siege of Rome was practically impossible. The city was protected by solid walls and numerous garrisons, and the Republic still possessed vast reserves of manpower. Even after the disaster, the Senate could raise new legions within weeks. Moreover, Hannibal lacked siege engines and sufficient supplies to sustain a prolonged blockade. A direct assault would likely have meant the exhaustion and destruction of his own army, precisely when he most needed to preserve it. Another major limitation was the meager support from Carthage. The Carthaginian Senate, dominated by the merchant faction, was reluctant to send massive reinforcements. Many believed maintaining peace and commerce was preferable to risking everything in a distant war. Thus, while Hannibal waited for troops and resources to consolidate his victory, only modest contingents and inadequate aid arrived from his homeland. This lack of support doomed his chances of turning the triumph of Cannae into Rome's final downfall. Rome, for its part, displayed extraordinary resilience. Far from surrendering after the catastrophe, the Senate adopted the policy of Quintus Fabius Maximus, avoiding direct confrontations and wearing the enemy down slowly. Instead of hurling desperate legions against the Carthaginian, the Romans chose to harass him, cut off his access to supplies, and buy time. The Roman people, though stricken by tragedy, accepted the idea that the Republic's survival depended on patience. Thus began a new phase of the war. Hannibal, who had burst into Italy with the force of a storm, now found himself halted, not by defeat in battle, but by an enemy that had learned from its mistakes. Rome refused to play by his rules. The Carthaginian general remained feared and respected. His presence in Italy was a constant reminder of Rome's vulnerability. But little by little, the initial momentum of his campaign turned into a long wait, a stalemate that would test not only his military genius, but also his capacity for endurance. For more than a decade after Cannae, Hannibal remained in Italy like a threatening shadow over Rome. His victories had been dazzling, but the daily reality of the campaign turned into a struggle of endurance and survival. The war he had dreamed of as a lightning strike to topple the Republic became instead a slow erosion, where time played in Rome's favor. Life for the Carthaginian army in Italy was harsh and precarious. After each march and each raid, provisions were quickly exhausted. Hannibal was forced to move constantly, seeking new sources of food in hostile territories. The Italian allies who had first welcomed him enthusiastically began to show fatigue. Some feared Roman reprisals, others doubted Carthage's ability to sustain them in the long run. Thus desertions and defections added to his difficulties. The general continued to display his tactical genius. On several occasions he inflicted further defeats on the Romans in minor engagements, keeping the prestige of his army intact. But none of those victories matched the scale of Trebia, Trasimene or Cannae. The Roman consuls, having learned from experience, refused to give him the decisive battle he sought. Instead, they shadowed him closely, cut off his supply routes, and relied on the Republic's inexhaustible superiority in men and resources. Time worked against Carthage. While Rome raised new legions year after year, Hannibal received no significant reinforcements. The Carthaginian Senate, divided and dominated by commercial interests, preferred to invest in other campaigns, especially in Hispania and Sicily. Even when they did send contingents, they were insufficient to change the balance. Hannibal, isolated, realized he was fighting not only Rome, but also the indecision of his own countrymen. Abbott highlights the irony of this period. The greatest military genius of antiquity was trapped in a kind of invisible cage. He could win in battle, he could terrify the Italian peoples, but without reinforcements and without the means to assault Rome directly, his presence in Italy turned into prolonged stagnation. With each passing year, his army dwindled further from attrition, disease, and lack of resources, and yet Hannibal never lost the respect of his men, nor the fear of his enemies. Even in the decline of his campaign, he remained a symbol of resilience, daring, and ingenuity. The Romans called him the Ghost of Italy, always present, always menacing, though unable to strike the final blow. Thus ended the years of stalemate, not with a sudden, crushing defeat, but with a slow exhaustion that wore Hannibal down, until Rome was ready to counterattack on other fronts. The oath of hatred that had marked his childhood kept him steadfast, but reality showed that the greatness of a general is not always enough when the homeland that sends him fails to provide the support he needs. Chapter 9. Scipio Africanus and the Campaign in Africa. Amid the dark years that followed the defeats at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae, an unexpected figure arose in Rome, destined to become Hannibal's great rival, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was the son of the consul wounded at the Ticinus, and, according to tradition, only a boy when he saved his father's life in that battle. From that moment, his name began to resonate as a symbol of bravery and filial devotion. Abbott recounts how, after the string of catastrophes suffered by the Republic, Scipio was chosen to take on a perilous command, the war in Hispania. Rome understood that to weaken Hannibal in Italy, it was necessary to cut off his sources of reinforcements and resources in the Iberian Peninsula, where the Barca brothers still held a strong base of power. Scipio set out for Hispania with a relatively modest army, but with an energy and talent that quickly distinguished him. His first great feat was the capture of Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena. This city, founded by Hasdrubal, was the Carthaginian capital in Hispania and housed arsenals, silver mines, and hostages from local tribes. Scipio executed a surprise attack, using the low tide to cross areas normally covered by the sea. The operation was a complete success. The city fell, and with it Rome gained not only a strategic hub, but also immense booty, and the support of numerous Iberian allies, who, impressed by the audacity of the young general, switched sides. The triumph at Carthago Nova was followed by new victories. Scipio defeated the armies of Hasdrubal and Mago, Hannibal's brothers, and consolidated Rome's presence in the peninsula. Each battle revealed his military genius. He knew how to combine the discipline of the legions with the tactical flexibility required to face diverse troops and seasoned commanders. Beyond his victories in the field, Scipio stood out for his clemency and diplomatic skill. He treated liberated Iberian hostages with respect, sought alliances instead of relying solely on force, and thus earned a reputation for justice and moderation. These qualities secured him the loyalty of many Hispanic peoples, who began to see in Rome not just a conqueror but a potential protector against the Carthaginians. In only a few years, Scipio transformed the war in Hispania. What had seemed a secondary theater became a decisive front. Carthage was losing men, cities, and resources, and most critically, the ability to send reinforcements to Hannibal in Italy. With the fall of Hispania, the noose around Carthage began to tighten, but Scipio did not stop there. His ambition drove him to conceive an even bolder plan: to carry the war directly into Africa, to strike Carthage on its own soil, and to force its leaders to summon Hannibal back from Italy. The success in Hispania gave Scipio not only prestige, but also the conviction that the war would not be won in Italy, but in Africa. Hannibal could continue harassing Rome for years, but as long as Carthage itself remained safe on its own soil, the war would never end. For that reason, the young general proposed a bold strategy: to carry the fight into the enemy's heartland. Convincing the Roman Senate was not easy. Many senators feared that opening a front in Africa would further weaken Italy's defenses. But Scipio insisted that the best way to force Carthage to recall Hannibal was to threaten their homeland directly. His strategic vision, combined with the prestige he had gained in Hispania, ultimately prevailed. Thus, in 204 BC, Scipio landed on the African coast with an army prepared for a monumental challenge. The African terrain posed new difficulties, but also new opportunities. One of the key elements of the campaign was the alliance with Massinissa, the Numidian prince. Initially an ally of Carthage, Massinissa had broken with them after dynastic disputes, and now sought in Rome a more reliable partner. His light cavalry, fast and versatile, became the perfect complement to the legions. Abbott notes that without this alliance, Scipio could never have achieved the cavalry superiority necessary to face Hannibal on equal terms. The first operations in Africa were dazzling. Scipio struck at Carthaginian camps and won several decisive victories, demonstrating the superiority of his discipline and leadership. The Carthaginians, shocked by the speed of the landing and the Romans' efficiency, were forced to summon reinforcements at once from all their colonies. The internal situation in Carthage grew desperate. The merchant faction, which had always been reluctant to give full support to Hannibal, now realized too late that the city's survival was at stake. They sent emissaries to Hispania and Italy, begging their greatest general to return as quickly as possible. Scipio, meanwhile, consolidated his positions in Africa. He raided the countryside to cut off supplies, destroyed fortresses, and offered clemency to cities that surrendered. His policy combined firmness with pragmatism. He punished resistance harshly, but won allies with the promise of fair treatment. Little by little, Carthage was encircled not only militarily, but politically as well. Hannibal, after more than 15 years in Italy, finally received the order to return. It was a bitter moment for the Carthaginian. He had defeated Rome countless times, yet had never received the support needed to turn those victories into final triumph. Now he had to abandon Italian soil, where he had left so many hopes and so many dead, in order to defend his native city. The final clash was approaching. On the plains of Zama, two of the greatest generals of antiquity were destined to meet face to face. The young Scipio, symbol of Rome's future, and the veteran Hannibal, genius of Carthage, prepared to fight the battle that would decide the fate of the Mediterranean. Hannibal's return to Carthage was a solemn and bitter event. For more than 15 years he had kept Rome in check on its own soil, defeating legion after legion, but the lack of support from his homeland had prevented him from securing final victory. Now, as he set foot once more in Africa, he understood that the city's fate depended on a single battle. His army, reduced and weary, was reinforced with hastily levied recruits and newly arrived elephants, but it was no longer the invincible force of Cannae. Before the final combat, Scipio and Hannibal agreed to meet. Abbott recounts the scene with drama. Two of the greatest military minds of antiquity, face to face, aware that history had cast them as eternal rivals. Hannibal, older and more seasoned, offered moderate terms of peace. Carthage would renounce its conquests and accept limitations, but retain its independence. Scipio, confident in Rome's superiority and backed by the Senate, rejected the proposal. There was no room for compromise. Rome sought total victory. The decisive battle took place at Zama in 202 BC. The field was wide and open, ideal for cavalry maneuvers. Scipio had the crucial support of Massinissa and his Numidian horsemen, while Hannibal relied on his war elephants and the experience of his veterans. The fight began with a massive charge of Carthaginian elephants against the Roman lines. Scipio, foreseeing the attack, had left corridors in his formations to allow the animals to pass through without wreaking havoc. Trumpets, shouts, and volleys of spears panicked many elephants, sending them back against their own troops. Hannibal's first gamble had failed. Then the Carthaginian infantry advanced in waves. First came the inexperienced recruits, who quickly crumbled under the disciplined pressure of the legions. Next the second line, with more resilient soldiers. But the true test lay in the third line, the veterans of Italy, men hardened by years of campaigning alongside Hannibal. There the fiercest clash took place. The Romans met relentless resistance, and for a moment, it seemed the battle might tip in Carthage's favor. It was then that the cavalry struck. Massinissa, with his Numidians, and the Roman cavalry that had triumphed on the flanks, returned to the field from the Carthaginian rear. The effect was devastating. Hannibal's veterans, caught between two fronts, resisted heroically, but were gradually surrounded and annihilated. The defeat was total. Carthage lost tens of thousands of men, and its army was destroyed. Hannibal, who had done all he could, managed to escape, but he knew the war was lost. Carthage was forced to sign a humiliating peace, surrendering its fleet, paying a massive indemnity, and renouncing all imperial ambitions. From that moment on, the city became little more than a vassal state of Rome. For Scipio, victory meant eternal glory. He was welcomed in Rome as a savior, and awarded the title Africanus, the African. For Hannibal, Zama marked the end of his military greatness. The general who had sworn eternal hatred of Rome now saw his homeland fall subject to it. The Western Mediterranean had a new master. Rome had triumphed, and the fate of the ancient world was sealed. Chapter 10. Hannibal in Exile. After the defeat at Zama in 202 BC, Carthage was reduced to the status of a Roman vassal. The city was forced to surrender its fleet, pay an enormous indemnity, and renounce forever any war not sanctioned by its conquerors. In this climate of humiliation, Hannibal, the great general who had brought Rome to the brink of destruction, returned to his homeland carrying the bitter burden of defeat. Many Carthaginians still saw him as a hero, the only man capable of resisting Rome for so many years, but others regarded him as the one responsible for the city's ruin. Torn between admiration and resentment, Hannibal chose not to withdraw. Instead of hiding in silence, he accepted an active political role. He was elected suffete, the highest office of the Carthaginian Republic, equivalent to a chief magistrate. Abbott notes that, in this position, Hannibal proved as skillful in politics as he had been in war. His first act was to attack the corruption that had corroded the government. For years, aristocratic families had used the war to enrich themselves, diverting tribute and plundering the public treasury. Hannibal reformed the taxation system, forcing the wealthy to pay what they owed, thus reducing the burden on the common people. In a short time, he managed to stabilize Carthage's finances, reorganize the state's resources, and even advance the payments of the indemnity imposed by Rome. These measures made him a revered figure among the common citizens, but also a dangerous enemy for the aristocratic elite, who saw their privileges threatened. The Carthaginian nobles, resentful of his reforms, began conspiring against him, even seeking Rome's support. The Roman Republic, meanwhile, watched every move of the Carthaginian with suspicion. Though defeated, Hannibal remained a feared figure. His very presence in power raised fears that Carthage might rise again under his leadership. His internal political enemies took advantage of this fear and sent reports to Rome, accusing him of plotting new intrigues. The Roman Senate responded harshly. It demanded that Carthage surrender Hannibal, charging him with conspiring against the peace. The hero of Cannae realized that his weakened and divided homeland could not withstand such pressure, and he faced a painful choice: to stay and risk being handed over to his enemies, or to leave his native city to save it from a new confrontation. Bitterly, he chose exile. One night, accompanied only by a few loyal followers, he slipped out of Carthage in secret and embarked eastward. Thus began a new chapter in his life. Far from the fields of Italy and the walls of his city, Hannibal set out on a wandering pilgrimage that would carry him from court to court, always as a foreigner, always as a fugitive, but never broken. Hannibal's departure from Carthage marked the beginning of a wandering life, in which the former general sought refuge among the kingdoms of the eastern Mediterranean. His first stop was the court of Antiochus III, king of the vast Seleucid Empire in Syria. Antiochus was in conflict with Rome and saw in Hannibal a valuable ally. The Carthaginian, true to his strategic genius, presented him with bold plans. He advised carrying the war into Italy, just as he himself had done, to strike the Romans on their own soil. Yet the court of Antiochus was indecisive. The local advisors and generals distrusted the foreigner and feared committing to such risky operations. Though Hannibal was consulted on several occasions, his ideas were rarely put into practice. When Antiochus finally confronted Rome, he did so without making use of his guest's counsel. The result was disastrous. The Romans defeated the Seleucids, and in the peace settlement, the king agreed to hand over Hannibal. The Carthaginian managed to escape before falling into his enemies' hands. From then on, his life became a constant flight. He sought refuge in Crete, where he even had to resort to stratagems to protect the little gold he carried, tricking the locals with chests filled with stones. Afterwards, he moved on to Bithynia, where he found protection under King Prusias I. There, despite his age, he continued to serve as a military advisor. Abbott mentions an episode in which Hannibal, serving Prusias, devised an ingenious tactic against a rival fleet. He filled jars with venomous snakes and ordered them hurled onto enemy ships. The panic caused by the serpents was so great that the opposing fleet fled in disorder, proving that the Carthaginian's genius remained intact until the end of his days. But Rome had not forgotten him. Roman envoys, obsessed with eliminating for good the enemy who had so often brought them to their knees, demanded his surrender whenever they discovered his whereabouts. Hannibal realized that the noose was tightening and that sooner or later he would be captured. In his retreat in Bithynia, when he learned that Roman troops were coming to arrest him, he made the decision he had long foreseen. He always carried with him a small vial of poison, prepared for the moment when no escape remained. Abbott records the phrase attributed to the general, "Let us free ourselves from the hands of the Romans. Let us not allow them the glory of my capture." With calm resolve, he drank the poison and fell dead, bringing to an end a life that had been a constant struggle against fate and against Rome. Thus died Hannibal Barca, the man who in his youth had sworn eternal hatred of the Republic, and who for decades had kept the Roman world in suspense. He did not fall in battle nor in chains, but by his own hand, faithful to the belief that dignity stood above defeat. His name was inscribed in history not only as one of the greatest generals of antiquity, but also as a symbol of resistance in the face of an implacable enemy. Chapter 11. The destruction of Carthage. After the defeat at Zama and Hannibal's death in exile, Carthage was reduced to the status of a Roman vassal state. Stripped of its fleet and its armies, forced to pay tribute for decades, it seemed doomed to fade away slowly. Yet the city showed a surprising capacity for recovery. Thanks to its strategic position in the Mediterranean and the skill of its merchants, Carthage gradually began to prosper once more. Its markets again filled with African goods, its granaries with grain, and its harbor with merchant ships. This rebirth deeply unsettled Rome. For the Romans, the memory of Hannibal remained vivid, and any sign of Carthaginian strength was viewed as a threat. Among the senators, the voice that stood out was that of Cato the Elder, a stern and seasoned statesman who had fought in Africa in his youth. Cato visited Carthage on a diplomatic mission and was astonished by the wealth the city still possessed. From that moment on, in every speech before the Senate, no matter the subject, he ended with the same phrase, "Citerum censeo, Carthaginem esse delendam." Moreover, I am of the opinion that Carthage must be destroyed. His insistence gradually seeped into the Roman mindset. Although Carthage formally complied with the terms of peace, any pretext was enough to arouse suspicion. A dispute between Carthage and the neighboring kingdom of Numidia gave Rome the excuse it sought. Claiming that the Carthaginians had broken the conditions of their submission, the Senate declared war in 149 BC. Thus began the Third Punic War. The Roman demands were merciless from the start. First, they ordered the Carthaginians to surrender all their weapons and their fleet, which was done with anguish. Then they demanded something even more terrible, that the people abandon their city and move inland, far from the coast. For the Carthaginians, this was unacceptable. To abandon Carthage was to renounce their identity, their history, their very soul. The response was unanimous. They would resist to the end. A desperate preparation began within the city. Weapons were forged day and night. Temples and palaces were turned into workshops. Women and children labored alongside men, melting down metal, twisting ropes, shaping projectiles. The Carthaginian spirit, though weakened by defeat, awoke with fury to defend its home. Rome, for its part, sent a colossal army under the command of experienced consuls. The siege stretched on for months and then years. Carthage's walls withstood the assaults, and each Roman attempt to breach the city was met with fierce resistance. The Carthaginians fought with the determination of those who know they have nothing left to lose. The siege of Carthage dragged on for 3 years. Between 149 and 146 BC, the Romans tried again and again to breach the walls, but the Carthaginians repaired them at night with the same tenacity with which they fought by day. Hunger began to consume the population. Pack animals were sacrificed, herbs and roots eaten, and still the city held out. The determination of its inhabitants astonished even their enemies. Finally, in 146 BC, Rome entrusted command to Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus. He was a young general, but one of strict discipline and severity. Under his direction, the siege became an implacable operation. Scipio tightened the discipline of his troops, cut off all supply lines, and launched a final assault that would be etched into the memory of the ancient world. The Romans managed to break through a breach in the walls, and the fighting moved into the city itself. What followed was one of the fiercest urban defenses in history. Every street, every square, every house became a fortress. The Carthaginians built barricades, fired from rooftops, and fought hand to hand in the alleys. Women and children aided the resistance, carrying stones, water, and projectiles to the fighters. For 6 full days, Rome and Carthage clashed in brutal combat inside the city. Flames consumed entire buildings, smoke darkened the sky, and the cries of the wounded echoed between the walls. Abbott describes how, in some districts, the Romans had to advance house by house, tearing down walls to avoid traps laid in the streets. The city was dying slowly, but it died fighting. On the 7th day, the resistance broke. The last redoubt was the Temple of Eshmun, where thousands of Carthaginians, men, women, and children, had taken refuge. When the Romans stormed it, many chose fire over slavery, hurling themselves into the flames or perishing in the collapse of the sanctuary. The survivors were captured and sold into slavery. It is estimated that more than 50,000 men and women fell into the hands of their conquerors. Carthage ceased to exist. Scipio Aemilianus, gazing upon the smoking ruins, wept according to tradition, aware that he was witnessing not only the fall of an enemy, but also the fate that one day could befall Rome itself. The Senate, in a definitive gesture, ordered the city razed, its lands cursed, and decreed that no one should ever rebuild it. With the fall of Carthage, Rome eliminated its last great rival in the western Mediterranean. Africa became a Roman province, and the Republic's power extended unchallenged. The phrase of Cato the Elder had come true, Carthago delenda est. But though the walls burned and its people were scattered, the memory of Carthage did not die. Its name lived on in the accounts of its enemies, and above all, in the immortal figure of Hannibal Barca, the general who had brought Rome to the brink of the abyss. Epilogue: The Legacy of Hannibal. The figure of Hannibal Barca stands in the memory of the ancient world as one of the most fascinating and contradictory. Born of an oath, trained in the camps of Hispania, and forged in the snowy heights of the Alps, he devoted his entire life to a single purpose: to bring Rome to its knees. And for years, he succeeded. No other foreign general had ever brought the Republic so close to ruin. No other threat had shaken so violently the walls of the capital. His victories, Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae, were demonstrations of tactical genius without precedent. At Cannae especially, he executed one of the most perfect maneuvers in military history, encircling and annihilating the most powerful army Rome had ever assembled. For centuries, that battle would be studied by strategists and commanders as the supreme example of cunning and discipline combined. And yet, despite his greatness, Hannibal was never able to transform those victories into final triumph. Abbott emphasizes that it was not for lack of talent, but because of the imbalance of resources. Rome could lose entire armies and raise them again within months, sustained by the loyalty of its citizens and by an unyielding state organization. Carthage, divided among political factions and ruled by merchants afraid to risk everything, never gave Hannibal the support he needed. Thus, while Rome resisted with stubborn determination, the Carthaginian general fought almost alone, condemned to inevitable exhaustion. The contrast is clear. Hannibal was a blazing star, brilliant and unique, but Rome was an entire constellation, able to endure the passage of time. The individual genius of the Carthaginian clashed against the collective strength of a republic that refused to surrender. The fate of Carthage, sealed with fire and ruin decades later, was in some sense also the fate of Hannibal. His city, unable to fully grasp the magnitude of his work, allowed him to wither in exile, pursued by the fear of his enemies and the ingratitude of his own. He died far from his homeland, choosing poison over the humiliation of falling into Roman hands. It was the final act of a man who had lived under a single oath, never to submit to Rome. And yet Rome itself always remembered him with respect. Its generals studied his campaigns, and his name became synonymous with audacity. In humanity's memory, Hannibal stands alongside Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar as one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. His legacy is not measured in conquered lands or in lost victories, but in the lesson his life left: that war is not only a matter of numbers or resources, but also of imagination, of will, and of the ability to turn every weakness into an opportunity. Thus ends the story of Hannibal Barca, hero and exile, conqueror and fugitive, a man who defied Rome and nearly changed the course of the world. His final defeat did not erase his greatness. On the contrary, it made it eternal.